Welcome to the Truth Over Comfort show. Today's guest is Matthew Ho. He's been on, I think, 4 times now. We've spoken about Afghanistan, Ukraine, and most recently, Iraq twice. He is an ex-Marine Company Corps commander. He was also a political officer in Afghanistan for the State Department. He also did policy for the Pentagon between those years. I always also forget to mention you also ran for senator recently. You've worked for a number of policy kind of groups, and most currently you're affiliated with the Eisenhower Media Network, which recently obviously put out that post in the New York Times, and you also recently put an article. I'll put that all in the show notes, and we can maybe get into some of that about Ukraine later. But I'm really glad to have you again here. How are you doing today, Matt? I think you're on mute.
Yeah. Good. I'm good, man. It's good to see you. Thanks for having me back on.
Yeah, so obviously, I guess for the viewers, last times we've, as I said, done Afghanistan, Ukraine, and Iraq, and we've kind of focused on just them. Today, going to have a bit more of a looser conversation, talk about the kind of Matt's road to join the military, what it's kind of like being in it, the hierarchy, what it's like being a veteran during the war when you realize it's not what you thought, and kind of post-treatment of that, and then just a number of other issues going on in the world we could get onto, as there's many in America and around the world. But yeah, so if you just want to tell people, what led you to actually want to join the military? Was this something you always wanted to do when you was younger? How much did 9/11 come into this? And just kind of, tell people what, led you to actually want to join the military or specific part of it.
Well, I joined the Marine Corps prior to 9/11. I went to officer candidate school in January 1998, and I had gone through college, and I had worked. I was working in finance, and I was bored. That's basically the best way to describe it. And I wanted to do something bigger with myself, challenge myself, be part of the big hand movement of history. I had this fear that I would wake up one day and be 40 years old and never have done anything serious. And I think you have to understand the 90s at that point, where I graduated high school in 1991, the same year the Soviet Union dissolves, and this was supposed to be a new world. I mean, when initially, now you say the words New World Order, and people scoff or they raise their eyebrows, or it's part of a conspiracy rant. But at that time, the idea that something different can come about, that the world could be remade new, that the idea that you had a superpower, a sole superpower, that was economically in control of the world. I mean, the entire financial structure of the world, economic, monetary structure of the world was constructed post-World War II for the United States' benefit. And now, without the Soviet Union and its empire, the world was the United States was the world's bank. And the United States was the sole military power in the world, sole diplomatic power in the world. And I think, too, you had a lot of goodwill towards the United States. I think a lot of what occurred during the Cold War, as heinous as it was, the millions who died in the various direct and proxy wars of the Cold War, I think at that point in the 90s, people were willing to say, that's behind us. That is not indicative of who we are now. That was those that were excesses because of this type of confrontation, but because of these dueling superpowers, and that's a world we are going to now get away from. And so I think you had this naive, of course, but optimism that existed about what could be and how the United States could be different. And so when I joined in January 1998, in the 90s, the United States military actions had been at that point seen, or at least portrayed, as being somewhat beneficial or benevolent, or they were it was humanitarian interventionism. And of course, now with hindsight, we understand the reality of that. But it was fresh and new. You looked at what occurred in Somalia. You looked at what occurred in the Balkans in the early 90s, and even you could look in what occurred with 1991 with the first Iraq War, and you could say, okay, there is a degree to this where this was setting an order, where this was protecting people, where this was trying to do something humanitarian. Again, in hindsight, I think we could pick a lot of that apart and deconstruct it. But in the moment, it certainly seemed that way. Even in '99, when the United States intervenes, or NATO actually conducts its first war, right? The first time NATO planes dropped bombs are in 1999. That is under the rubric of a humanitarian intervention, that they're going in to stop genocide occurring by the Serbs. Again, now in hindsight, we understand, well, that wasn't the whole story. That's not the whole case. It's much more complicated than that. And of course, there were nobody had white hats on. And I think that is what, I think you summarize it, everything I'm trying to say here, is that at that point, though, in the mid 90s, late 90s, there is a belief that the United States could be wearing a white hat. Now, of course, if you go and you talk to Noam Chomsky or Howard Zinn, or, of course, not Howard Zinn, but say, read Howard Zinn or Chalmers Johnson, their understanding at that time of the American empire, the trajectory of it, makes what I just said laughable. But that was the zeitgeist. That was the feeling. And certainly as a young man who wanted to challenge himself, I felt that, joining the Marine Corps was a way to be a part of that. It was a way to be a part of history, be a part of this emerging new world order, and, be a part of something bigger than myself, as well than the seriousness taking on. I actually wanted to be a firefighter. And at that point in the 90s, the big city fire departments either had just missed the exam, or the exam wasn't going to be for another year or two, or you had a residency requirement that would take me a year or two to meet to move to Philadelphia or something like that. So I was anxious and in a rush, like a lot of people are who are 22, 23 years old. So in January 1998, I was at Officer Candidate School in Quantico, Virginia for the Marine Corps.
Yeah, for people not familiar with the New World Order speeches by George H.W. Bush, I think it's before the Gulf War, but yeah, it's quite funny, me looking back, or other people, the Soviet Union falls, to the people there, this could be changed within, a year or so. America already invading Iraq. Obviously, there might have been certain reasons given to justify it, like obviously that Iraq actually invaded Kuwait and it wasn't a war of aggression. But it's interesting looking back that how, they didn't wait around, did they, to get the first war going?
No. And of course, now we understand the United States, and we've talked about this before with the Iraq war, right? The United States, the Carter administration had basically given endorsement to the Iraqis to start that war. And then you see in 1990, when the Iraqis approach the Americans, particularly when they approached the Ambassador April Glaspie, and she says, the United States doesn't see its place as getting involved in the affairs between Arab states. They see that in diplomatic speak as being, go ahead and launch your war. Just that 10 years before, the Carter administration had more or less done that with the Iraq's invasion on Iran. And all that comes out later. You don't see that. And of course, we know now that the selling of the war, all the stories that were not true about the Iraqi horror show or human rights violations in Kuwait, the famous stories about how the Iraqi soldiers were throwing newborn babies out of incubators and letting them die and shipping them. And we know that was all false. We know that was all lies, that was a big public relations a campaign conducted by an American public relations firm called Hill and Knowlton, one of the biggest public relations firms in the world. And so that all comes in hindsight. But at the time, it looked very clear that this was a war of aggression, that this was there's a simple explanation for it, that there was a fight over oil that was exasperated by, and this plays into what Bush was saying about a new world order, about how things are going to be different. I remember when we discussed that, when people would discuss that war, there was a lot of talk about the boundaries, the borders of the Arab world, of the Gulf world, and how those boundaries have been set by Europeans earlier that decade or earlier that century. And so that played into this idea of we're going to make this world anew. This is a chance to do this correctly. This is a chance to leave the past behind. And of course, you have Francis Fukuyama come out with his book, The End of History. All those types of things that played into this, so that if you were reading the New York Times, if you were reading The Economist, like I used to subscribe to those, right? Get them delivered in my house as a young man. When I was 14 or 15 years old, just so everyone understands what kind of nerd I was about this stuff. My older brother gave me a subscription to The Economist, right? And I thought that was the greatest thing. Right. So I was very well informed, but I was very well informed on the establishment viewpoint. Right. The idea of the existing structures, the existing powers to be, how they viewed the world and how they told the story of the world. And that's what and then I went to a very good public high school. I went to a very good private college, and you could go through those schools and never have read Noam Chomsky or Angela Davis or Malcolm X. You could go and have a great liberal arts course of study and not be exposed to those types of critique of American empire, let alone the understanding, not just the modern critique, but the understanding of the continuous line of empire, how we pick up from you all, right? I mean, what the Brits did, and how, so you could do that, and you could understand the errors or mistakes or excesses, as you would probably call it then, of American history. And you would have rationalizations, excuses for it, or you would say, but we changed, So certainly viewing things as isolated incidents, to the point that the idea of that being, say, a systemic racism in the United States was not really spoken about, not really discussed outside of very small circles. Until I would say into this century, basically. But way you discuss it then is the African slave trade, the creation of an internal slave system within the United States. I live here in North Carolina, and one of the things that you don't get taught about is that when the United States Congress says we're not going to bring in slaves from Africa anymore, well, that's because states like North Carolina and Virginia had developed their own system for growing slaves. They had farms, if you will. I'm not sure what the right term to use without being grotesque about it, but basically that was it. So one of the things was that you had these businesses in North Carolina and Virginia that produced slaves that forced people to mate and then sold their offspring off. And that had grown to the point by the early 19th century that the U.S. Congress said, we don't need the African slave trade anymore. That's a competition to our own internal slave systems. Right. And these are things that you don't hear about, and then the Civil War, of course. And then, you have what occurs post in the Reconstruction period, as we call it, and in the Jim Crow period and the Civil Rights period. And you could have a really good education on all that, but then still not have been provided the tools to see how that is just one continuous line, that you could know all these things and you could get you can get a 5 on your advanced placement test. Advanced placement's a thing you do in high school where you earn college credit here in the United States. 5 was the top score. So you could get like a 5 on advanced placement American history, know all these facts, know all the key figures, can write good essays about all of this. But then not really had been approached with the idea that this is one continuous line. And so what you see now is a result of what had come before, that this is all the natural evolution. So getting back to, say, using the first Iraq War as an example, not understanding that continuous line, it's very easy to see that war then as a limited incursion, and not as an extension of American involvement in the Middle East, which had at that point been going on for a couple of decades in a very, very serious militarized manner. So yeah, I mean, I try and be gracious with myself or generous with myself because you see that too now. When you encounter people discussing whether it be whatever, whether it be, say, the war in Ukraine or, say, what's occurring in Africa, the militarized foreign policy of the United States in Africa, and try and get people to see it as this is no different than what was done in Central America. This was no different than sending the Marines into the international delegation in China at the turn of the 19th century. This is no different than that. But it's hard when you're up against an establishment media and an orthodox education system that is devoted to teaching history in an uncritical way.
Yeah, I mean, you could do a whole interview about how the education system just really, same in Britain. You learn about the Nazis, you learn about the Bolsheviks. I learned about the British Empire in sixth form, but it's like the 1600s. I'm not saying every school does the same thing, but it's interesting, what specific things they choose. Like the Opium Wars were just like I mentioned, like not do like a whole thing about the Opium Wars. It's just, this went on and slavery is going on. Like, that was me personally, but I think most people could agree that, the education system and even just normal subjects, but that's a side issue. Just to kind of get back.
Well, just an example of that, one, the Opium Wars are never discussed in the United States, and the vast fortunes that Americans and key American families, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the Delano part of that family, that's where the money came from, was from opium. John Kerry, the current U.S. ambassador for climate affairs, or whatever his title is, that's where a lot of that money comes from. The Kennedys, like vast fortunes were made in what was called the China trade. But then too, you can have things. I just had this conversation the other day with someone, and she's an American citizen now, but she was born in Russia and lived there for a good part of her life. And, explaining to her like the whole progression of the American empire in the sense, and this is something that, most Americans don't realize, that the subjugation of the last Native American tribe in the United States occurs around 1891, 1892. And then within a couple of years, the coup in Hawaii occurs. And a couple of years later, you have the Spanish-American War. So, in a seizure of Puerto Rico and Cuba and the Philippines. That's all taught disparately. That's all taught as isolated events rather than seeing that, okay, so we finally have subjugated the first peoples of this continent. Okay, now we're going to go overseas. And even that's not completely true, because the United States have been mucking around in Japan, have been mucking around in China at that point, in Korea. And then, of course, we'd had the Monroe Doctrine in the United States since 1823, I believe it was. It's been 200 years, I think, where the United States has declared the entire Western Hemisphere its province. No one else can come in here. But you still will now have, if you describe the United States as empire, if you counter the idea that somehow the United States was an isolationist nation prior to the Second World War, which is in American media, you can read articles in the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal where that is accepted as a truth, that the United States was an isolationist nation prior to World War II, which of course is just simply untrue. So yeah, there's a lot that you talking about the headwind that you go into with this. It's quite a bit, yeah.
Yeah, just going back to, I guess, leading up to your journey of, joining the military, you kind of spoke about a bit, but can you just give people the idea, I guess, of the view inside America and Americans about the military? Because even today, like, it's clearly, held up in a really high regard. There'd be like baseball games or whatever, and they have, soldiers. I know it's kind of to keep patriotism going, but was that part of the reason that you think you joined the military? Because just the general kind of ideology in the country that, the military is seen in such light, rather than, how European powers, use their military to colonize people. Did that play into you joining the military?
No, not so much. It was never the patriotism. It was never the my country right or wrong, or getting excited about the idea of saluting the flag or wearing a uniform. And actually in high school, I had been very interested in joining the military. And then the first Gulf War, I could have gone to West Point, to the United States Military Academy at a high school. I've been accepted there, as well as received college scholarships for the Army. And seeing the first Gulf War, the first Iraq War, we call the Persian Gulf War, upset me quite a bit. And I at that point believed that war was a war for oil, a war that was did not need to occur. I saw, even all the things I just said about how we, the general U.S. public, viewed the first Iraq War, and to a great extent still do. I differed from it even at that point. I felt it was immoral, that this was a war that had need to be fought, that this was a war for oil. And so, yeah, I didn't go to West Point, didn't take the ROTC scholarships, which are the Army scholarships for college. I went to college, studied philosophy, comparative religion, read a lot of literature, graduated college, worked for a couple of years in finance. And like I said, I was bored. So when I ended up going into the Marine Corps in January 98, my reasons for it were different than what I had when I was applying to West Point in 1990. At that point, when I was in high school, it was more out of there was like an interest in the military as an institution. And I remember seeing the military as a vehicle to then go on to other things, even in high school. So I remember having to write a college entry essay, and the essay was about, you come back 30 years after you graduate and give a speech at a, and I wrote, because again, remember, I've got subscriptions. I'm a 16, 17-year-old kid with subscriptions to the New York Times and Economist. I'm writing about how I come back and I speak to the university, and I'm the Secretary of State. So I saw the U.S. military as an entry into the foreign policy community, and something I have always been interested in. Obviously here we are talking about these things, and with a think tank and everything else. And so I have been very blessed, and I am very grateful, because if I think my 16, 17-year-old self could see that, as a 50-year-old man, your job is going to be to read the news and critique it and offer, policy proposals and things like that. And, that I think that kid would be pretty happy. So, but that's more why I'm doing that now. There's a will for it, and it is, I guess, a calling, if you will. But it also has much more to do with Forrest Gump-like reasons for it being than from anything else, I think. But the decision when I went in, was really motivated by a desire to, challenge myself, to push myself, to do something dangerous, to do something serious. As opposed to, the seeing the Marines in their uniforms at a Mets game or something like that,
So how far into, so you said you joined the Marines in 1998. Obviously, we've spoken about before, 2004, 2005, you were a Marine Company Corps commander in Iraq. Obviously, we know from that point on, you could see kind of the criminality of that war.
Yeah.
Before that, obviously, you have the invasion of Afghanistan and, it's Kosovo and Serbia, as you said. So how far into, I guess, the military did you kind of realize maybe this isn't what I thought it was? Was Iraq the biggest tipping point? Was there, before that, you're thinking, right, this isn't what I thought it was going to be?
Yeah, Iraq was the biggest thing. The Kosovo really air war, right, was outside of anything I would have ever been involved with in the Marine Corps. And it was limited. And there's a lot of, again, the media reporting on it, the discussion on it, ensured that this was seen as a limited war done for humanitarian purposes. The Afghan war, I remember the day after the September 11th attacks, and my friend and I were having breakfast. He was also in the Marine Corps. And we were talking about it, and we were both just convinced that we would never be involved with it. That this, after what the Soviets had gone through in Afghanistan, and from what we knew that this was a terror attack, or it seemed as that way at that point, the day after, that this was not anything the Marine Corps was going to be involved with. This is something for the CIA and the FBI and Special Forces guys. The Iraq War, though, was that, and even too, and then in those couple of years before the Iraq War, what was occurring in Afghanistan, the U.S. And NATO presence there was really pretty limited. And you could kind of look at it in a sense of like, yeah, of course, if you put guys with guns in the midst of a civil war, they're going to get shot at, and there's going to be this, trying to create order is going to be very nasty and brutal and violent, in a country that's been undergoing a civil war and a war against the Soviets and everything else for, at that point, 20 some odd years. So it's kind of like that understanding of this is how it goes, but the idea of like, why would they be so stupid as to be committed to this? Eventually, at some point, we're going to say we're all set and pull out, just as we did in Somalia, say, or say as Ronald Reagan did in Lebanon in 1983. So I think there was that thinking that, okay, eventually there's no value here for us. We've done what we could, and they're not going to get sucked into anything deeper. And then, of course, the Iraq War, by the time I get to Iraq in 2004, it's very clear what has occurred there, the lie-in, the manipulation in order to get that war. And then, of course, that the war was going terribly. Excuse me. So my trajectory in the Marine Corps was, after I went in the Marine Corps, I was stationed in Okinawa, in Japan for 3 years. And then from there, I went to the Pentagon. So I get to the Pentagon and I'm in the Secretary of the Navy's office in November of 2002. And I was a Marine Corps captain at that point, and so I was the junior Marine Corps officer on the personal staff of the Secretary of Navy. So I was, a small bump on a big log kind of thing. I had a view of things that most people at that point in their careers don't ever have. And so my exposure to how the Iraq War was sold, how the Iraq War was conducted, how the Marine Corps and the Department of the Navy handled themselves during that was galling. But I think what occurs I shouldn't say I think what occurs, I know what occurs, is that you lie to yourself. You rationalize it. When I went in the Marine Corps in '98, we still had plenty of colonels and generals and sergeants major who had been in the Vietnam War. And they all stood in front of us and all said that war was a mistake, that war should never have happened, et cetera, et cetera. And they said, we're never going to do that again. And within a few years, we were in 2 Vietnams. So, the ease of lying to yourself and saying that things are going to be different once you're involved, or that you're going to do things different. Or like when I went to Iraq, my first time, the idea was, well, I can be a moral actor. I can be a moral agent in the spaces around me. What I do will be good. I'll be benevolent. I'll help, And when I went there the first time to Iraq, I was on a State Department team. I was a Department of Defense civilian. Because at that point I had left the Marine Corps and gone into the Marine Corps Reserves, and I went over to Iraq as a Department of Defense civilian, so a U.S. Government official on the State Department team on the part of the U.S. Embassy. And this idea that, okay, well, in the spaces around me, I will be moral. And incredible mistake, incredibly naive, completely foolish, because the force of nature that war is, this uncontrollable nature greater than man, that ensures that you will be an agent of the war's immorality, whether you like it or not. This idea that you're going to be your own agent within war is just, it's ludicrous. As I look back, at the time I believed it was possible. And then you're there for a year, you realize that, but then it becomes, you start telling yourself, when I get to be a senior person, I'm like a mid-level person now. When I get to be a senior person, I won't make these errors. I won't make these mistakes. I won't make these decisions. I keep saying mistakes, and these weren't mistakes. These were deliberate decisions. And, it's that. And then it becomes, when I have, I'm at the State Department. I go to Iraq for a year. I come back. I'm at the State Department on the Iraq desk, and I get an email from the Marine Corps Reserve saying they're looking for officers to volunteer to go back to Iraq. And so I do, because at that point I thought, well, I was a pretty good officer. I've been to Iraq already. I understand it. If I go, there's a better chance of bringing back people alive than if some of these other guys go. So, then it becomes about like, you're good. It's not about yourself. It's about, you can take care of others, so it's this continual restructuring of the lives, of the rationales, of the excuses, as one falls apart, you create another one. And so I go a second time in Iraq, I come back, at that point, then then the war is really hitting me. I'm intellectual and I'm morally broken. I'm dealing with PTSD. I've got probably the traumatic brain injury that I have, where the real difficult symptoms don't manifest and surface until around 2014, 2015, because that's the nature of those types of brain injuries. There's latency with them. But I'm sure there's aspects of the TBI that's already occurring at that point. So, and then of course the moral injury, this idea that what I took part in was wrong, that what I did was wrong, this transgression. So, at that point, you start using the alcohol to cope with that. And, there's this divide within you over whether or not what you did was wrong. And then you're using the alcohol to numb yourself and cope with that. And struggling to hold on to what you once believed in, and this idea, then you also in my case, you try and banish away that morality, banish away these principles and say, okay, I'm just going to be someone in the service of the empire, right? I'm going to be just as, because when I came back from the Marine Corps after my second time in Iraq, at that point I had resigned from the Marine Corps. And I had decided that if I do this, which I wasn't certain, I took months and months off. I got job offers from commercial construction companies, and I always went back into the State Department or the Pentagon. And, the idea that I would just be, okay, this is what I can dedicate myself to. And I'm just a piece of meat in the service of the empire. But there's aspects about that I've always maybe wanted, or this is the type of being part of serious things that I part of being part of history, right? And so those are all the things that lead me into going to Afghanistan in 2009 with the State Department as a political officer, having just a really incredible job, if that's your thing. I mean, my job was, I was a political officer assigned in a province. I was a senior American senior American civilian for that province. And my job was to work basically as a colonial administrator. So right out of like the British Empire, all I needed was the little helmet and the shorts with the socks pulled up to my knees, and I could have been in Kenya or someplace like that, or India. So that was the type of experience that it was. And every day my job in Afghanistan was to get up and walk across the street. I was on this little American base, which was in the center of this little small Afghan city, and the governor's compound was right across the street from ours. So get up and walk across the street and have breakfast or lunch and then dinner later with the governor. And that was the whole job, was to be this colonial advisor, to be this agent of the empire. And there's, but that tension is there where you're doing this and that it's wrong. That what you're doing is fundamentally incorrect for a host of reasons, not just the moral reasons, but also too that this is not working and it's never going to work. And so I was there in 2009. That's the year that President Obama escalated the war. And he had already escalated the first half of 2009. There had been a major escalation of U.S. forces in Afghanistan. And then in the second half of 2009, there was a big to-do about whether we're going to continue that escalation and do a surge. And we had already surged into Afghanistan. So much of this was just media theatrics and posturing by the generals. And, but General Petraeus and General McChrystal were adamant, and they had supporters in Secretary Clinton and Secretary Gates to go forward with this escalation of the war, and again, the morality of it, but then too the idea that this is futile. This is doomed to failure. All you will do is going to be all you're going to do is increase support for the insurgency. And sure enough, that's what they did. And now of course the Afghans are in a different stage of their war, a war that goes back to the late 70s. Prior to the Soviet invasion. I mean, most people don't know this, but that by the time the Soviets invaded in 1979, maybe as many as 100,000 Afghans have been killed in the fighting already. So this is a war that goes back to really 1978. And while there is violence still, the Afghans are in a different phase of the war where they're starving to death. So, and this could have been, that could have been avoided. This war could have been brought to an end much sooner. You could have had, that's a different conversation, I guess. But the point being is I get to the point where I resign in protest. I say I can't go along with this any longer. Again, I think because of the moral reasons, but also too the practical reasons of it.
So you mentioned that you was using obviously alcohol to kind of numb yourself. Is that you also doing that while you're working for the State Department in 2009 for the State Department in Afghanistan, or is this kind of in the period in between?
In the period in between. So certainly when I was flying in and out of Afghanistan and staying at the Meridian Hotel in Dubai, and the times I'd be up at the embassy in Kabul, and they have a bar there and they have a little liquor store, you drink. But when I was out with the Army on these bases, the U.S. military had a pretty serious no drinking policy in Iraq and Afghanistan. It was violated, of course, but in the position I was in, I had no interest in doing that. And it's interesting to get into the idea of PTSD and everything and what that does to you. Up until that point, I remember going to Afghanistan. I was drinking so heavily, and wondering what was going to happen when I get there. Am I going to have problems? Am I going to is my body going to go into shock not having the alcohol? And what occurs is that I remember getting to Kabul, and right away I felt like I was at home, because that's what the PTSD does to you. The PTSD, if people understand it, or maybe PTSI, where rather than saying post-traumatic stress disorder, you say post-traumatic stress injury. But the idea is that your survival system that came into being to protect or help our ancestors when a saber-toothed tiger walked into the cave. So you get those survival chemicals rushing through your body, the adrenaline, the cortisol, et cetera. Then something occurs, like you go to war, and particularly my second deployment, where more or less every day you're out hunting for other people and other people are hunting for you. Well, your survival system gets, remember, it's meant for when the saber-toothed tiger comes into the cave, not to be on all the time. Well, it gets stuck. If you imagine as a valve, right, that opens to release those survival chemicals when you need them, well, that valve's stuck open. And so you're living always amped up. That's why you have this hypervigilance, this hyper alertness. This is why you have sleep problems, and then all the things that cascade out of that. All the different issues that come from those, the secondary and tertiary aspects of PTSD, which are really disabling and cause all kinds of problems, lead to an ability to function, a destruction of relationships, and also as well suicide. But when I got to Afghanistan, when I got to Kabul, I clearly remember, feeling okay, feeling like I'm at home. And so much of this psychological too, because at that point in 2009 in Kabul, there was no danger. They weren't rocketing the embassy. Yeah, maybe there might be a suicide bomb attack on a convoy, but those happened very infrequently in Kabul at that point. So there wasn't even real danger, and I was aware of that. But just being back in that atmosphere put me and my mind, my psyche, my nervous system, this is where you should be. And so, at the time I was in Afghanistan before I resigned, I didn't have an issue with the drinking. As soon as I got back home, though, right away, it picks right back up. I remember flying back into Dulles Airport and, taking the bus, because at that point, if people believe this, if people can really, we didn't have a train that ran, and we only recently do, a train that runs from the international airport in DC to downtown. If people, if people want to understand how piss poor American infrastructure is, that's a great example. And we finally have one now. I think it's open. I'm not sure, but anyway, but having the drink right away, kind of getting through the day, my first day there, and like right away back to the drinking, even though for the months prior that had not been an issue. It hadn't been an issue at all. So again, I think that has a lot to do with your survival system's out of whack. It's that valve is stuck open, and your body is prepared for a fight, and you're in a circumstances where there's not going to be a fight. And then, of course, too, I think when you're back home and you're out of that bubble, that gives your mind a lot more opportunity to pursue things that you don't have time for over there. So I think, and coming back and after resigning like that and being told over and over again by the people I met, people I knew, people I worked with, that they agreed with me, this war's not worth it. I remember I had to go. So I write this resignation letter, and it goes to the ambassador. But my immediate boss in Kandahar, he agrees with it. He says, I'm not going to write this, but I'm not going to stop you from writing it. And you're not saying anything that's wrong here, and then, but he also too is interesting. What you had kind of a difference in terms of who was over there. He was a guy that was only going to be there for 1 year. Then he was going to go back to some other State Department job and never have to look at Afghanistan or think about Afghanistan again. The military and then other guys like me in the State Department, CIA, other types who were, this was our thing, the wars were our thing. We were never going to get out of that. So, but, I remember the deputy ambassador in Afghanistan, at the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, U.S. Embassy in Kabul is unique that it had a deputy ambassador. But he said, look, I've got kids that are military age, and there's no way I would ever let them come to Afghanistan. Right. And then the same thing too, the ambassador says, I could, he says he likes what I write so much. He's like, but I need you to stay. I need people like you to stay on with me if we're ever going to do something about that. And at that point, I was so broken, morally and intellectually, that there is no way I could do that. And but he said, if you stay, I will write the forward or the introduction to your resignation letter. That kind of going back to then getting back to the States and having to meet Ambassador Holbrooke and going up to D.C. because he was at the UN General Assembly, and going up to the Waldorf Astoria and meeting him there. And I go into his suite, and who's coming out is Sherrod Cooper-Coles, who was the British ambassador to Afghanistan, the British special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan for a number of years. He says to me, oh, you're that guy. I read that thing. I completely agree with you. Then I go in there with Holbrooke, and Holbrooke's, I agree with 95% of what you said, and I want you to be on my team. And I sent your letter directly to the president, to the vice president, and the secretary of state. And I know Secretary Clinton read it, and, all these things, Meantime, my peers are in agreement with me. So my peers, the other political officers we had in Afghanistan who were in the most violent provinces like I was, so they were in Uruzgan and Helmand and Kandahar and Nuristan and, I forget where, maybe up in Kunar and Nangarhar, they all agree with me, so that's all you're getting is this agreement. And then what's occurring, though, is that no one's doing anything about it. So everything you've been a part of, everything you've given your life to, is filled with these cowards who see the futility of what you're doing, who see that this is wrong on a host of different levels, and they go along with it, knowing full well the price of that, the consequence, is death and destruction and suffering, and in a geopolitical context, an increased instability. We know that this type of occupation drives insurgencies. We know that this type of occupation drives militancy. From that comes more extreme groups. Case in point, there's no Iraq and there's no Al-Qaeda in Iraq until we invade, occupy, and create the need for an Al-Qaeda in Iraq, right? So you have, so that's another thing I think that drives the drinking for me, is just that type of of juxtaposition between what people know, say, believe about the war and what they do about it, the cowardice. So I got to be friends with the guy who was the U.S. political advisor to NATO. And, Jack said that in 2009, when Stanley McChrystal's plan to escalate the war in Afghanistan and, send 80,000 more troops there or whatever his original plan was, everyone said, no, this is insane. This is nuts. This will never work, and it will make things worse, throughout NATO. But then Jack said when it came time to sign off on it, everybody initialed, And so I think I had a tough time dealing with that as well, with seeing the reality of the decision making of the people who were involved, the cowardice. And then, of course, I had already seen U.S. decision making at senior levels, because again, I've been in the Secretary of Navy's office. I've been a White House liaison officer. I had then been, when I was at the State Department, worked more or less at the deputies level, which is one down basically from the cabinet officers. So you're talking about your number 2 and 3 people at the State Department, the Pentagon. So I've been around that. I had seen that and been part of these different working groups, and everything else. And yeah, just the reason for the decisions, the political reasons for it, but also the ignorance that underlaid it and the arrogance that underlay it. Yeah, I mean, all that drove to be this need to drink to deal with it. So it was not just like the personal things that were driving the alcohol use, the self-medication with it, but it was also the external things as well, trying to the anger that came from that had to go somewhere, and it went into the alcohol.
I mean, the irony, obviously, of all the billions going into Afghanistan for reconstruction projects, kind of like maybe building railroad to come back to the airport and not actually have something that is kind of the idea of being built in another country, I guess, kind of just shows the perfect representation of, the priorities of the military adventures rather than some of those same projects actually done at home. Just to
right. I mean, exactly. I mean, the idea, I remember having this point in at some point in 2010, 2011, a plan got put out to introduce high-speed rail in the United States between D.C. and New York. Maybe it was D.C., New York to Boston, but at least D.C. to New York. And it was going to be 10 years, $100 billion. And, at that point, the United States was spending $100 billion a year in Afghanistan. And the idea of connecting by high-speed rail the world's political capital, Washington, D.C., with New York City, which is more or less the capital for everything else, right? Economics, culture, entertainment. The idea of connecting that by high-speed rail for the same cost of 1 year in Afghanistan, and it couldn't even be considered. It was immediately dismissed,
Yeah, I mean, even today, obviously, every day, well, not every day, once in a while, someone to compare, all the aid going to Ukraine, and then they get a video of all the homeless people maybe in LA or somewhere. Just
absolutely.
A massive problem. So I guess that kind of segues me to the next kind of bit of, I guess, the treatment of veterans. So while you're there, is there someone you can go to about these feelings, post, obviously, service? Lots and lots of homeless people, even in England, you speak to them, I was in the army, and obviously the military itself, constantly goes on about, how we care about other people in other countries. And that's why we need to intervene and, pick a country. But then they literally don't treat those people who are going to do that the same way they speak about. So, what was your experiences of dealing with the military? How do they help people, or do they not? For you personally, I guess, just in general, up until today?
It's gotten much better over the last decade, but in the first years of this war, of these wars, so going back 16, 17 years ago, the Veterans Administration was completely under-resourced. The military had the view, the Pentagon had the view that as soon as that person steps out of uniform, they're no longer the Pentagon's responsibility. And the VA, of course, so the disservice that was done to generations of World War II veterans, Korean veterans, Vietnam veterans, as well as Cold War veterans, all these men and women that had, some had nuclear weapons testing done on them, radiation exposure with or without their knowledge. We have scores of them were exposed to chemical and biological weapons with or without their knowledge. Plus, just the fact that the military is a dangerous occupation. A lot of things, there's a lot of accidents, a lot of things go wrong. So you have a lot of veterans who become disabled for lots of reasons, and so the under-resourcing of the Veterans Administration had going on for decades, and it comes to a head in the 2006, 2007. And it's not until about 2010, 2011 that the money starts to go into the VA to make a difference. And I will give Barack Obama a lot of credit for that. In particular, General Eric Shinseki, who was the Army general who famously dissented from Don Rumsfeld and the rest of the Pentagon in 2002 when he went in front of Congress and they said, Don Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz and everyone else, they're all saying that the White House, they're all saying this war is going to be a cakewalk. And the Congress expected Shinseki, who was at that point the Army Chief of Staff, to go along with that. And Shinseki said, this is going to require hundreds of thousands of troops. And, from then on, he became persona non grata. He was he retired ignobly, they did their best to humiliate him. And he was proven right, of course. And then Barack Obama put him in charge of, Eric Shinseki in charge of the Veterans Administration. And with that funding comes the resourcing of it. I'll give you an example of just not just the resource in the sense of that the money wasn't being allocated, but the effort wasn't being allocated. The prioritization, the taking on the responsibility wasn't there. So it's well known. This goes back to Homer. This goes back to Shakespeare. This knowledge that veterans come home from war and kill themselves, very clear. And in 2011, the Veterans Administration was still not assembling data nationally on veteran suicides. So you had all these different reports, anecdotal sources, but also serious reports from universities, healthcare facilities, veterans groups that say, particularly with the Vietnam veterans, because that was a generation that could be talked about. But we also know this happened to all previous generations of war veterans, including the good wars, World War II. These guys come home and they kill themselves en masse. And, but in 2011, the United States Department of Veterans Affairs was still not collecting data nationally on veteran suicides. So if you asked the VA in 2011 how many veterans are killing themselves, they didn't know. And they would then it went to this thing where they started to aggregate data from the Center for Disease Control, and they extrapolated a number of veterans that kill themselves based on the reports of 18 states. And General Shinseki came in and said, this is nuts. This is crazy. How are we not doing this most basic task? I remember there was another time a study or a report that came out of the VA in 2015. It was either 2014 or 2015, where it talked about the effects of killing and how it said that, in this report, it said that the VA does not ask veterans about whether or not killing someone has had an effect on them. Exactly. I remember talking to my friend about this, and he was like, am I on crazy pills? Am I reading this correctly? The VA doesn't act about the effects of killing. You're sending these young men and women overseas. They're taking part in killing. They're seeing their friends getting killed. They're killing people. And VA never asked them about that. And that was the reality. That's the truth of it. So the VA has gotten much better. The problem being is the VA is the second largest budget the problem being now is that the VA is the second largest budget in the federal government. Its budget for this coming year will be about $330 billion, which is, well less than half of the $886 billion the Pentagon is going to get, but it's a great deal more than anyone else. I think Homeland Security is third with $120 billion. So that's how big the VA is. The VA then, of course, now you get into issues of the politics of it. We know that half of that Pentagon budget, right? Let's just call it $900 billion. We know that half of that goes to the weapons contractors. We know that the Pentagon has a civilian contractor workforce of 250,000 people. That's bigger than any other workforce in the federal government, aside from the VA. So the VA, with 300,000 employees or 300 spots that could be filled and a $300 billion a year budget, is a cash cow for privatization. And that's the big fight that people are in right now, veterans are in right now, is trying to keep the VA from being privatized, from it being, but at the time, when I first started going to the VA, it was the wait times were ridiculous. The quality of the staff was very poor. Just the nonsense. When I first went to the VA to get help, this is in late 2011, for my issues, for my post-traumatic stress disorder, what I would come to understand as moral injury, for my suicidality, for my drinking. It was like I was joining in on and taking part in like a bad Saturday Night Live sketch. It was like terrible sketch comedy that was going on. It was just that ridiculous and that miserable of a system, where you would call the mental health clinic at the Veterans Administration, a VA hospital, and no one would answer the phone, and the voicemail would be full. I mean, I'm speaking about that from experience. Like, that really happened. It happened to me. It happened to my girlfriend at the time. I remember her trying to call. I mean, you had a system that had just been, and so they have done a very good job of resourcing it, of professionalizing it. I think particularly on the mental health side, because the unique aspects of mental health care for veterans is something that is different than what you find in the general population. One of the things that you tend to see in the VA is you get a lot of really great mental health care providers, because if they want to be on the front lines, so to speak, if you want to go someplace and work with people that are killing themselves at levels that are off the charts, you're going to want to work at the VA. If that's your calling, if that's who you are as a psychologist, psychiatrist, mental health care professional, that's where you want to go if you want to be in the thick of it. So, but it was one of those things where a lot of people were further damaged, further hurt, further disabled. Many of them lost their lives because when they came home, they did not get the care that they needed.
Yeah. Do you know the current stats on, what sort of level veterans are killing themselves? Because I kind of see it go around. I haven't checked it myself. People say at times veterans are killing themselves more a day or a week or a year, wherever it may be, than actual combat deaths. Obviously, that can be, due to the sense of the military, obviously, at the moment. So what are the current kind of stats about, veterans killing themselves or trying to kill themselves?
So, the VA starts putting out suicide reports in 2012. They had not done that before. And they get to the point in 2014 where they start putting out really great reports, a lot of information, a lot of data. You can go into it and you can figure out that a male veteran in their 20s from the Iraq and Afghan wars had rates of suicide more than 6 times greater than their civilian peers. So, a young man that comes back from the Iraq and Afghan war, he's got his suicide rate is 6 times higher than his friends who aren't in the military, and in some cases you saw that go up to 10 times higher. You saw extremely high levels of suicide among women, and women don't kill themselves generally at the rate that men do. And this has to do with the wars, but this also has to do with the epidemic of military sexual trauma, the harassment, the assault, the rapes that occur in the U.S. military that are endemic, that are systemic, which very little has been done. A lot of talking about this, people, and which is great that people are talking about it, but very little has been done to do something about it. And I know people will say, well, what can be done? Well, the United States military is a disciplined organization that has total control over its people. A lot can be done, as well as changing the way these things are dealt with legally within the military. I mean, there's all kinds of recommendations that have been made to address this endemic military sexual assault and rape that the U.S. military simply has not chosen to take on. So you see it in things like that. But so you have like this report in 2014 that really shows this very clearly. And you can look, and they have historical data as well. So you can look and you can see, gosh, here's the chart, and you can see the war generations, the veterans, the guys in their 80s. World War II veterans. And the same thing too, late 70s, 80s, Korea War veterans. At that point, and say guys in their 60s, Vietnam veterans, you could see their rates of suicide much higher than say people who are in at that point, say like people in their 40s. I may not have the ages all lined up right, but people who have been in the military during the 90s, right? And then you see the effects on the generations that were in these wars. And you can see the high rates for those who come back from war. You also see, too, a generally elevated suicide rate among veterans, whether they went to war or not. And it's not nearly as high as what we see among those who went to war, but it's still higher than the general population. Problem is that after that report in 2014, the VA starts every year to starts putting out less and less data. There's a political cost to the VA for them to say that these wars have a moral effect on veterans to the point that they put guns in their mouth and blow out the back of their heads. So what you start seeing by 2016, 2017 is a lot less information being reported, a lot less data. And these reports become good news stories. And they highlight how if a veteran is in veterans health care, they have a significantly less chance of killing themselves or being killed by suicide, I should say, than those who are not in veterans health care. And that's a great thing to know. And that's a great thing to demonstrate and show. But that should not be the point of the report at the expense of ensuring that people understand just how catastrophic the suicide rate is among veterans. So, unfortunately, the most recent report was the same. Very little information that you could work with. A lot of cheerleading, saying what things are good. They'll get into some niche category. So they'll they'll put out two reports in a row about the effects of COVID on veteran suicide, which, certainly something you need to address, but that should not be the focus of the report. And so anecdotally you hear it. I just know I saw a thing on Facebook. I didn't know him, but a guy from a unit I was in killed himself last week. So it continues, and you do get to the point where I would say most of us know more people who've been lost by suicide than were killed in action. The other aspect of this, and there was a report done by the University of Georgia last year, so the rate of suicide for veterans is the number you hear. So in 2014 or actually it's 2012, I think the number comes out, 22 veterans a day are killing themselves. And that number is down to 16 veterans a day are killing themselves. However, that's not good news, because the reason why that number drops is because so many World War II and Korean War veterans have passed away. So your pool is much smaller. So even though you're having 22 you're not only having 22 a day killing themselves, you're having 16 a day being killed by suicide. That doesn't mean that there's been a reduction in the rate. That just means that your pool, the total number of veterans that you can get that data from, has diminished greatly. So you can have the case like you have where 22 a day is a less rate than 16 a day actually when you do it per capita, right? So one of the things you have with these reports is you have I think a misunderstanding of like how deep and how broad the problem is, how endemic it is. And then the other thing, as I was saying, University of Georgia comes out with a report and they say, you know what, we've been looking at this and we're pretty certain that the number of veteran suicides a day is double what's being reported because accidents and overdoses are undercounted. And they had some methodology where they were really able to dig deep into it, right, and produce this peer-reviewed, everything else. So the idea that what you see accidents in veterans. So a guy drives his motorcycle into a bridge abutment at 100 miles an hour. Was that an accident or was that suicide? And in the overdoses, of course. And it doesn't really matter, right? I mean, whether a guy ODs or and it's an accident, or it was suicide. It doesn't matter to his wife, doesn't matter to his kids, his family, I mean, but you see that. So I tend to think that we have a much higher rate than what the numbers are.
Yeah, you'd imagine that a lot of people part of the opioid crisis, homeless
Right.
crisis, are ex-veterans, so you got to take that into account, or just even people who are living who are addicted to opioids or just in a general, because obviously we're looking at data for actual suicides, which is basically the worst of the result. So take into account all just the people just generally not being able to enjoy their life, not being able to control their emotions, feeling like morally hurt from everything that happened. So just kind of going back to what you're saying there. So obviously you've said it's improved a lot over the years. The budget is quite big. And when you first said it was about 300 billion, I almost thought you was going to say that came out the Pentagon's budget, but I guess
Nope.
not. I mean, if you got almost 900 billion budget plus that, it's the same budget really. It's for the
It
same
is.
issue. Those wars caused that budget to be so big because of the destruction. And in the
Right.
ideal world, one of the solutions would be, well, maybe we shouldn't, try to get into every single war we can or provoke wars. But that's, idealism and not reality. So I just thought I'd ask, why is it, do you think that before it wasn't, really, the VA wasn't really respected? Is it the era of the attitude of men just get on with it, or is it just financially just they don't want to basically fork out this money, a mixture of both, or there's a spectator that I guess is if they've gone to these wars, seen these things, and then they self-destruct and kill themselves. I mean, do they see that as one other person who can't speak out about it? I guess that's probably not. I guess more the two. Is it more the era of men just get on with it, don't show your emotions, these things you shouldn't speak about, or just not really wanting to pay out, or the what would be your assessment? I guess.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, let's go back to the suicide stuff though in the VA and what they were doing well and what they were doing poorly. The one of the things that exasperates the suicide rate is, as well as too, just the overall welfare of veterans, is the VA does a really terrible job. They are one of the worst offenders of prescribing opioids. So what you have happen is as you have over the last 20 years, this crazed prescription of opioids, which creates this opioid epidemic, worldwide, basically, right? The VA is one of the worst offenders of doing that. That their pain management centered around pills, to the point that you had, so many veterans consuming so many opioids that it has that effect as well, right? So you have this veteran, and then you couple that with people who are looking to self-medicate, looking to help, looking to deal with what they've been through, to deal with the PTSD, the TBI, the moral injury, the military sexual trauma. And yeah, I mean, fortunately for me, I was always good with the alcohol. Like the alcohol always did enough for me. Like fortunately, that's the way my genetics are. But a lot of guys and gals aren't like that. The alcohol is not enough to help compensate and deliver a degree of acceptance to them that allows them to live with what they're struggling with. And so they turn to, right, the drugs. Your point about the fact that the VA budget, does not come out of the Department of Defense budget is, a really good one. The fact that there's a consequence to these wars. There's a consequence of having, 1.5 million or about 1.8 million man and woman standing army. There's consequences of these things. I think what you see is that, post World War II, after World War II, the U.S. government goes to great lengths to suppress what's occurring with veterans. That there is a political need to continue the idea of the good war, to put forward this embrasure of America as a force for good in the world, right? The political needs and the messaging needs of the Cold War dictated that American veterans of World War II could not be shown as being suffering from the consequences of those wars. And the same with the Korean War. You went to Korea to fight against the communist hordes and to keep Koreans free. You can't come home and say that you're feeling bad about yourself. So the United States government goes to great lengths to suppress it. They suppress films. They don't talk about it. They don't do any research. And then also too, the culture at the time was such that people didn't talk about these things. When I first started talking about these things a bunch of years ago, more than 10 years ago now, you come across World War II and Korean veterans sometimes, and they'd be with their wives, and they'd say the only person who ever knew about this was her. And of course, what that means then is that family is just devastated by the trauma, because where does that trauma come out? It comes out onto family members. And there are a couple of books written about this, by the children of Vietnam veterans, what it was like to have a war veteran as a father, what that does to a family, dealing with that trauma. And the only release for the trauma is inside the house, because when you leave the house, everyone smiles and no one says anything. So, that attitude and that culture starts to get deconstructed post-Vietnam. But it's not until 1980 that the American Psychiatric Association even denotes post-traumatic stress disorder as a real thing. So PTSD doesn't become like a recognized, thing until 1980. So you have all that time where you don't even have the official medical acknowledgement that this thing exists. I think you have just culturally through the 80s and 90s, more people being more open, talking about mental health. I think so. It's a broader cultural transition that when the Iraq and Afghan veterans start dealing with it, you have a greater degree of acceptance within the communities, within the population for these types of discussions. There's politics involved in it, in the sense that I think there are many who wanted to point out how awful these wars were. Look what the Republicans did to the troops, that type of thing, the betrayal of them, so that adds into it. And I think that has a role in terms of particularly the media speaking more about it. So, it's also too veterans advocating more for themselves, veterans speaking about this. There's still a lot of misunderstanding, of mistaken assumptions that this doesn't occur, and this is a modern phenomena. As we said before, Homer wrote about this, Shakespeare wrote about this. If you go and look at the literature from after the American Civil War, so late 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, you'll see that there is reference all the time in various literature throughout that period to the Civil War veteran who is dying drunk in a town square someplace, or who overdoses on morphine, or who dies sleeping out in the cold, homeless. Over and over again, you see that reference. And what we know, based upon what some research has been done, is that the estimate is as many Civil War veterans died after the war from the effects of the war, the long-term effects of the war, including overdose, because the American Civil War, kind of like the Crimean War of the 1850s, is where you start to really see the use of morphine. And so the estimates are that American Civil War veterans may equal the number of dead of the war. And there were 700,000 killed during the war. And so the idea is that there may be as many as that, but at least 400,000 is what the estimates are, die after the war from suicide, overdose, exposure. So this is common, but it's only really, I would guess, in the last generations that it's spoken about in a way that there's some compassion and understanding. Because even in the 80s, when I was growing up, your understanding of the mental health issues of Vietnam veterans was Rambo, right? This killer who comes home from Vietnam, who's isolated now, and don't push him because he'll freak out and kill everybody in the town. And that was kind of, the entertainment complex's way of dealing with the Vietnam veterans who came home. And many people saw that with sympathy. And, the great comedian George Carlin would talk about what Vietnam veterans would go through and things like that. And people met that with sympathy. But I think a lot of it's got to do, again, with how we've become more open as a side to these kinds of discussions.
Yeah. So do you think most people who end up, feeling depressed have to opiate themselves, numb themselves, whichever it may be, they all kind of lead to the same
Mhm.
place from the same, reasons. Do you think that's more to do with the moral guilt of, wow, look what I thought it was, look what we actually did, and then, scandals, leaks come out, and you realize you was completely lied to, and actually, you was kind of the wrong side of history? Or is it more just general PTSD? I can't believe that that wasn't a thing till the 80s. I get maybe they didn't have a name for it, but all these Vietnam veterans, Korean veterans, all correlating with the same feelings. The fact that, yeah, like you said, that there was no question on the VA, like, oh, how did killing other human beings affect you?
Right.
Just because this reason was told, like it's not what we do. Hang on, I lost my train of
Right.
thought. There
Yeah,
was
and it
the
wasn't until about 4 years or so ago, maybe a little longer, that the VA actually initiated its first program called the Effects of Killing (EOK) uh, as a program, as a therapy program. Like we're right. I mean, so but we know this. There are a host of studies that have been going on. The earliest one I've seen goes back to, I think it was 1981, 1982. That's the oldest one I've been able to find that talks about the effect of killing, its correlation to suicide. So yeah, you do see that among combat veterans, this relationship, and it's borne out by studies over and over and over again. If people have a question about that, I'm happy to have written about it. I'm happy to send people links to various studies. Every year, more studies are done connecting what's called moral injury to suicide. And so among combat veterans, that relationship is very clear. The VA's own data shows that it's those who attempt suicide and not successful. It's about getting away from the distress, the severe distress that they are experiencing mentally, emotionally, spiritually, because there's a very real spiritual component to this as well. A lot of veteran suicides among the general veteran population, so combat and non-combat veterans, um, you know, you're going to have the same issues that you have in society. So if you have an increase in suicides, as we've seen in the United States among the general population, that's going to be mirrored within the Department of Defense and veterans. And then you have among women veterans, the high rate among women veterans, and that a lot of it's got to do with excuse me, the military sexual trauma, as it's called. So there's a host of things that go into this. There's also been some work done that show that people who have experienced trauma in their past uh, tend to seek out places where they can replicate that trauma or they can dive back into it. Right. So, you know, that then puts them in a position where they are further at risk by joining an organization that is more likely to produce trauma, like the military. So all these different factors come together. And so there's no one answer for it. Although I will say that the studies do show that among combat veterans, you do see a very high correlation with suicide based upon their experience in combat, particularly in their experience with killing.
Yeah, I just a thought kind of came to me because we are talking like most, people would come out of these wars. Any normal person you would feel would be traumatized by these wars. So I kind of just got thinking, people who have fought in these wars and then go on to be mercenaries or start their
Mhm.
own kind of groups. What is the mindset of them? Because you'd think they'd gone through all of that and they know probably that it was a fraud, and then they go on to be a mercenary. Is that more just money? Or I guess the people who set up the other groups, you'd think, well, they like to play the game. Maybe they, against Russia, China, whoever it may be. So yeah, I guess what would be the mindset of someone who's fought on these wars? They've seen the same things as these people. One goes off traumatized, potentially kills themselves, and the other goes to be a mercenary, which is basically, just straight up kind of to be a
Right.
killer.
Yeah, it's one. I'll say you get a lot of people going through these wars, going through the military. I think there are 2.7 million Iraq and Afghan veterans for the U.S. military. So it's a lot of people. So you're going to have that. You're going to have that disparity in terms of the mental, emotional, and spiritual response to the war. You're just going to have that. Some of it has to do with people joining, these mercenary firms, these contractor firms, for the money, because the money is quite good. Others because they really enjoyed the work and they want the camaraderie. They want to always have a rifle in the hand, kind of like I did, almost 30 years ago now. Wanted to be part of something serious. Some of them are psychopaths. No more of an explanation than that they're psychopaths. Others believe in what they're doing. So they believe that the U.S. Mission overseas is a benevolent one, that what's being done over there. I mean, I came across a guy who was adamant that he had gone to Iraq to bring religious freedom to brown people, as he said. And several months later, he killed himself. You know what I mean? So the idea that they still believe, and then I think there's a lot of people who may be still fighting all this in their head. So they don't want to open up those doors in their mind that they're afraid they can't close. This is one of the reasons why you see much higher rates of suicide among veterans than you do of, say, active duty military. Because when you're still in the military, you're in a bubble, you're in a community, you're part of a team. It's when you get outside of that and you're on your own that I think maybe you're able to have these thoughts. That it's easier to have these thoughts. It's free, and you also give it more time. You're still part of the military. It's not something you can worry about, contend with, because you're a professional warrior, and that's not your place. I mean, you hear over and over again from people in the military, that's above my pay grade. If you talk to them about the morality of these wars or the practicality of these wars, and aren't these wars counterproductive? Is going to make this really making things better? That's above my pay grade, so they dismiss it. So I think a lot of that as well, and that's something I was trying to do. If you go back to early in the conversation when I was going to Afghanistan, was that struggle within me to get rid of this emotional and spiritual and morality baggage, and to get rid of this notion of whether or not this is a good policy or not, or and just embrace what I'm doing and let people above me let them worry about it. And then when I get to that level, I can worry about it. But just do a good job, be of service. And I think that's how many people see it, and certainly get people who stay in who disagree with the wars. Because I talk to a lot of people, veterans and active duty, who are opposed to these wars. We're opposed to these wars, opposed to the war in Ukraine right now. Because they see it as futile, they see it as counterproductive, and they see it as immoral. But they don't see it as their place to challenge it. They see that their position or their station in life does not give them either the requirement or the responsibility, the obligation, or the authority to challenge these wars. That, look, man, I'm a machine gunner. I'm a maintenance officer. This is my job. My job's not to worry about things like this. My job is to do my job and take care of the men and women under my command. So you did, and you see. I was just going to say, because you see that in the public opinion numbers. I haven't seen a poll on this in a year or two. Because we've, in the United States, we've forgotten about the Afghan and Iraq wars. But 2 years ago, as the United States was retreating from Afghanistan, the Taliban was on their way to victory and everything else, the Kabul government was collapsing. More veterans of the Iraq and Afghan wars said that those wars were not worth fighting than members of the civilian population. Not by much, it's a couple points, but the point was there. And those numbers were 2/3. So 2/3 of the Iraq and Afghan veterans saying that these wars were mistakes. They should have been fought. So that's a pretty serious number of people then that went through these wars, have had time to reflect upon it, and who said, no, these wars should never have occurred. That's an astounding number. But then you also have a third who think, no, these wars did have a purpose. They did serve a purpose. They did bring religious freedom to brown people, as he said. But I think in his case, the guy I'm referring to, I think he was fighting that in his head. And I think when he lost that fight, it was too much, and the distress was, and I'm speculating, I probably shouldn't be doing, but you see that over and over again, that type of collapse that leads to the distress. That is, I can tell you that distress is absolutely punishing. It's brutal. Like the moral injury, the 3 invisible wounds I carry from these wars, moral injury, PTSD, and traumatic brain injury. The moral injury by far, and I as we've discussed, my traumatic brain injury, I suffer from migraines are just completely debilitating. I can't do anything but being a ball, and like just ride them out. No medication's going to help me. It is just completely. I would take those any day than to deal with the moral injury. Absolutely. I would just prefer to have that type of be debilitated 24/7 than to ever go back to struggle with the moral injury again. That's how bad it is. That's how distressful that really is.
Yeah, just to give people background, Matt was going to do an interview with me last Friday, but he had one of these migraines, and I was so naive to say, "Oh, I've had migraines. Yeah, they're bad. I wouldn't want to do that." And then he comes back with the email, yeah, most likely because of brain trauma from the wars, and I was like, "Yeah, I'm pretty sure my migraines were pretty light level compared to that." So I was a bit naive.
Well, I don't know. Everyone's migraines are different, so you shouldn't compare. That's one thing I'll just say too. Just what I've dealt with, because I'm a peer support professional. Haven't done it in a number of years though. But whenever I've worked with somebody, and I've said the same thing too. You just said it. One of the things we do, I think, to compensate, to protect ourselves, to rationalize what we're going through, is to always say, "But what I'm going through is not as bad as what you're going through or what they are going through," or and it is a mechanism that ultimately is dangerous to us. I think it's damaging to us. It's hurtful. Most of us do it. It's just something that you have to recognize, and because it's a way to minimize what you're going through, to not accept it, to again rationalize it, or to So yeah, but no, certainly. It is something that the level and that extent of traumatic brain injury. The VA estimates that 250,000 Iraq and Afghan veterans have traumatic brain injury from the war, most of it from explosive blasts. So it gives you an idea of how violent the wars were, but those numbers don't bear out in the sense of just straightforward casualties. One, because most people don't know this, is more contractors were killed in Iraq and Afghanistan than members of the military were. And that's because those contractors were all doing jobs that in previous wars they would have been wearing a uniform. So that helps to hide the cost of the war. But the other thing, too, is our body armor and our vehicle armor. We all survived things that previous wars, or even early in these wars, we would not have survived. And we walked away from them. So your vehicle gets completely blown up. You walk away from it. You dust yourself up. You think you're okay, and then 7, 8 years later, or however long, maybe 5, maybe 3, whatever it takes, everyone's different, the traumatic brain injury sets in. So yeah, the VA estimates about 250,000 Iraq and Afghan veterans have traumatic brain injury.
Yeah, just do it before I ask a couple more questions. We're coming up to an hour and a half. Are you good for 10 more minutes?
Yeah, I'm good. I'm good until 2:00 my time here, 7:00 your time. So yeah.
Okay, so 20 minutes. Yeah, I'll give you some more time before that, because I know you jumped straight on from the last one. So yeah, I'll try and finish it up. I guess yeah. So you was just speaking about, I guess, soldiers saying it's not my place to say that that's above my pay grade. Do you think that's why, because the amount of soldiers obviously fought in these wars and currently, occupying Syria or wherever it may be, is it that we just don't hear about these soldiers speaking out because of the media, or is there just a genuine inkling, the hierarchy of the military say, I'm a soldier, that's above my pay grade, or, this is my job. Their job is to make those decisions. So I guess, because the amount of people obviously fought in these wars, you'd think you'd have, thousands of people who've come out and spoken out of it, and there's no chance it could ever carry on. So I guess, yeah, where do you fall on that question? Is it they're not being heard, or the hierarchy of the military itself kind of means they don't?
Yeah, I mean, based upon the public opinion polls that we have, what we know about how veterans of the wars feel about these wars, yeah, we should have thousands marching in the streets, and we don't. And we should see an involvement in politics, but we don't. The exception, I think, being libertarians in the United States have a lot of that. That's if I see a politically motivated veteran in the United States, almost always they're a libertarian candidate. I think there's a few reasons for it. I think one of it is that we have the all volunteer force, so we don't have a draft any longer. So I think the idea that everyone volunteered, we all chose to go, makes people more reluctant to speak out afterwards. They feel awkward about it. Like, I chose to do this. They don't have they jumped into it. They weren't drafted. And I think that has an effect in the sense of people not speaking out, people not getting involved. I think a lot of it, people just want to leave it behind them. I think there's also the aspects of the way there has been a lionization, a quasi-religious celebration of veterans in the United States that precludes speaking out, that causes veterans to be hesitant in speaking out because they don't see their voice being matched in what is being said about them. And it causes a really, I think, dangerous dissonance as well. You go overseas these wars, you come home, you say that war was counterproductive, that war was a mistake, that war was based on a lie. What we did to those people was terrible. I just took part in organized murder, however you want to describe it as. And then you come home and you go to a hockey game or a baseball game, and everyone stands up and cheers all the veterans in the crowd, which happens at every game, right? And that's just the basic of it. You know, in the level, I don't know how it is in Britain. In the U.S., if I'm wearing a Veterans for Peace T-shirt or anything else, I've got another Veterans Charity T-shirt I have. It's got to deal with dogs, actually, with the working dogs we had over there. But if someone sees that, it's automatically thank you for your service. I've given anti-war speeches where people afterwards will say thank you for your service. I mean, there's a ritual obligation, there's a religious obligation to it because of the way veterans have been elevated. That people feel that they are that they're performing a sin of omission if they do not thank a veteran for their service. So you have that happen where every time you open your mouth and say it, thank you for your service, everything else, you get applauded at the baseball game, whatever it is. We have 2 months in the United States where veterans are celebrated. May, because that's when our Memorial Day is, and then November, which is our Veterans Day, which used to be Armistice Day. And to your all credit, in Britain, you guys still call it that, but during the Cold War, the United States changed it from Armistice Day to Veterans Day. So we have more or less 2 months where there's celebrations of veterans, and you get free things at restaurants and 10% off here. I get 10% off everywhere I shop. You know, and sometimes it works out pretty good. You know, you got to buy something expensive from the hardware place. It's not bad, right? You know, buying something at $600, you know, get $60 off, right? I mean, so there's, you know, I shouldn't complain too much, you know, but, you know, it's all encompassing. It's all around you. And that creates a dissonance between, again, the guy who comes home, doesn't feel right about these wars, doesn't agree with what he did, doesn't see himself as a hero, or doesn't see herself as a hero, and is thanked for her service, you know, and so that dissonance. And if you open your mouth and say something, it's going to be upsetting to people. You're going to be insulting the idols of the tribe, as Bacon would say. People get very disturbed by it, right? Because this is a fundamental truth that American veterans are heroes. Right. Even if people be like, oh, no, the wars in Iraq in Afghanistan were based on lies and everything else, the troops were still good, you know. And so, you know, I think that's a real issue for people to get past, because in the anti-war community, we struggle with this, you know, where we don't have a membership that relates to the degree of dissatisfaction and disgust with the wars among veterans. It's very difficult for me to come across. I mean, I'm serious. A person who is over in these wars who doesn't agree with what I'm saying, you know, and that includes people who are still in the military or some other form of government service or in the State Department or CIA or whatever. They go along with it. And again, for the reasons we spoke about before, you know, that's, you know, but yeah, it is. It's you don't see the public opposition from veterans as you did say following Vietnam. I think again that has a lot to do with the draft versus an all-volunteer force. I think it's got to do with the lionization of veterans. You're right. I mean, so it makes it awkward to speak out if everyone's calling you a hero, whether because you're having a dissonance in your own head about that, or because it'd be upsetting to people. And so, yeah, I think there's a bunch of different reasons, but it is problematic because you then have political forces as well as entertainment and cultural and other forces, commercial forces that take that use veterans for their advantage. So yeah.
Yeah, I think especially in this country too, World War One and World War Two really shapes what people think about the
Right.
military. Like, the people who went there obviously drafted. It's still empire times. People kind of see past that, but the people who went there, like, that was obviously a horrible experience. And I think it falls in the line of thinking, the same as you mentioned, you're going to be a fireman. Like, the intention there is to do something.
Right.
Except with the army, they had the great intention of wherever it was after 9/11. They thought they was going after these people or were going to save this. It's the intention. So people like, thank you for your service, because you had normally a heroic kind of mindset to go and put yourself in that. And instead of a fireman where you're always kind of going to be on the right side of history, you fall on the wrong side of history, but people don't know where to go with it. Because again, I think World War One, World War Two really shapes. That was a long time ago. It really
Right.
shaped what people think about the military, their heroes. That's not the same as the people who bombed Libya, and
Right.
it's a complete mess, or Iraq. So yeah, that's definitely a struggle. But again, I wanna do the last question because I want you to actually have
Sure.
enough time to go to the toilet, grab a drink. So I guess the last question would be, what would what's your message to people in active duty or just come out who are struggling with some of these issues? Where do they go? What are good support networks? Just general advice, I guess.
One, I would say that there are other people, a lot of people who think like you do. You're not alone. Again, the public opinion numbers show you this, that what you did has no bearing on your intentions. I think the point you just made was very well said. People join the U.S. military, I'm sure, as they do with the British military, for a host of different reasons. Economic reasons being among the top, right? We don't have a draft, we have a poverty draft, is kind of what we'll say here. But nobody joins. Maybe there's some psychopaths, of course, and I use that term literally. There are people who go in because they want to kill people. But most of it is the intentions are good, and you think you're going to be wearing a white hat, and your intentions are not the same thing as the foreign policy goals of the United States. And so you were used, you were manipulated, you were betrayed. So understanding that and accepting that, but then too, if you are struggling, you are having issues, the importance of professional care. You're not going to get through this by self-care. I thought I could. That's such bullshit. The whole self-care thing is complete nonsense. I think, some people will feel like, the first year or so of doing self-care, they're better. It almost always collapses. You need professional help. And I'll say that to friends and family as well. People need professional help. And this is endemic and systemic. I've used those words over and over again. This is what veterans go through. So if someone you love is going through this, it's not because of them. It's not because of their genetic makeup or because their parents didn't hold them enough for some reason like that would set them apart from all these other veterans are going through it as well. So the idea of getting people into help, of holding people's hands. I'll say that most of the veterans I know, I come out of the combat arms, so most of the guys I served with were guys, were men. And so what gets us into treatment, what gets us into care, what gets into therapy, usually are women. Usually it's women in your life that force you. So if you are someone in that position, a mother, a spouse, a daughter, a girlfriend, and I'm not trying to exclude what women are going through because, as we spoke before, the whole military sexual trauma thing and other aspects, but just because this is what I know, I've had my experience, it's generally women who get the guys into help. Oftentimes it's girlfriends and wives who give ultimatums. And sometimes, because you have to protect yourself, you have to get yourself away from it, because the idea that PTSD is contagious is completely true. This notion of secondary PTSD that you get having to living with someone who is like that and having to walk on eggshells full time leads you to experience is trauma. And that leads you to then experiencing PTSD. And that's a very real thing. So, all those things, but you need the professional help. And so if you're going through this, if you recognize in yourself some of the things I've said, get professional help. If it's someone you love, get them into professional help. You may have to be tough about it. Every person's different. Some people respond well to tough love. Some people respond well to hand holding. Some people you have to baby. You got to know what the person you love is like, but the other thing I will say finally is that this takes a long time. It takes a very long time. It's not a 6-week program. Things don't get better. They get different is a good way to look at it. It's going to be very difficult to process, but you're more than likely to survive if you go through that process, which could take years and be continuous and be a lifetime long process, than you will if you just try and white knuckle it, do self-care, or God forbid, think that it's really not affecting you and you're just going to ignore it, because that's a pretty good way to make sure at some point you'll be putting that pistol into your mouth.
Yeah, well, anything you want to send me, any links, anything, I will put it in the show notes. So if there's anything you think of after that's helpful for people to do with this subject, I'm happy to put it in there. I'll also put in the link to your recent article about Ukraine. Obviously, completely different subject, but it's going to lead to a lot similar people in similar situations.
Absolutely.
But just before we finish, and I will just let you jump off after, just tell people where you are. I know you've maybe people who've watched us before will know, but just for anyone who's not sure, again, I'll put it in the show notes.
Sure. I'm the appreciate it, man. I'm the associate director of the Eisenhower Media Network. So you can go online to Eisenhower Media Network. I'm on Twitter at Matthew P. Ho, P as in Patrick. So last name spelled H-O-H. So at Matthew P. Ho. And then I am on Substack at Matthew Ho. So MATTHEWHOH and Substack.
Yeah, well, thank you for coming on. I mean, we pretty much spoke about veterans and everything throughout the whole interview. So hopefully people found it useful. Share it with anyone who's in the army or in service or anything like that. Hopefully they can help them. But again, thank you for giving me your time, Matt. I really do appreciate it. Again, we always run over, and you've just done an interview before me and after. So well done for getting this information out. Maybe it's part of, I guess, you getting all of this, putting good back into the world after your personal experiences. So again, thank you, Matt, and I hope to speak soon.
Yeah, thank you, Louis.